Alex, thanks very much for coming in today to talk about constructive alignment. It's a big area and it can be quite complicated, but we're just going to touch on some basic issues here this afternoon. Briefly speaking, what is constructive alignment?
It's nothing new. Constructive alignment originally was coined by Biggs and Tang. We're going back a good few decades, but actually it's incredibly simple and it's stating the obvious from many perspectives. Constructive alignment is the idea that you have three stages throughout a learning process and that they are aligned. So ILOs, CAs, ATs. Now what are they? ILOs, intended learner outcomes. We often refer to intended learning outcomes or learner outcomes because you don't necessarily always get the outcomes that you plan. But anyway, we have our intended learner outcomes.
And that's, for example, the learning outcomes a teacher might prepare for a lesson on their lesson plan.
And this could be very small, i.e. one lesson, or this could actually be something that oversees a 3-year course program. So you could decide on the scale of how you apply constructive alignment. So your ILOs are the intended learner outcomes, but you then have the classroom activities, your CAs. So the point is really simple, that when I have an ILO, that I have a very similar, or in fact the same, requirement in my intended learner outcome as I do in my classroom activity. I'll explain a bit more in a moment. And then the third stage of that is the ATs, which is the assessment tasks. And what you're looking for is a thread, a logical thread between the ILOs, intended learner outcomes, classroom activities, and the assessment tasks. What is found in a lot of research, and it's quite surprising, but often you'll have some ILOs, an intended learner outcome, which may be set at this level, but then you have classroom activities that may be at a different level, and then you have assessment tasks that may be at a different level altogether. And if that happens, you're tricking the student because you're not actually giving them the consistency they need to rehearse, endorse, and compound the cognitive processes behind the learning. So it's about lining up those three things in a chronological system, which is actually really obvious. Decide what you're going to teach, teach it, test it, but make sure those three are aligned.
As you were speaking it made me think of when I'm training teachers, and if you've got new teachers, people who haven't been teaching before on a pre-service training course, for example, it's something that they don't often get instantly, the training teachers, because they say, okay, I'm going to do this activity, or the stage aim to this activity is X, but then they do an activity which actually doesn't achieve that stage aim. So it's a skill to be developed, really.
It is, and one might say the intuitive teacher would do this anyway, but actually there's a lot of support available and a very simple approach to constructive alignment. Now, you could identify in your intended learning outcomes, the activities in the classroom, and then your assessment tasks, the kind of cognitive processes, the learning that's going on behind the activities. And these will usually be representable with some kind of action verb. Now, if we take a very basic verb, it may be, well, we often refer to Bloom's taxonomy these days, or one of the other taxonomies. You might say to analyze. So you could say in an intended learner outcome, the candidate will be, or the student would be able to analyze a given text, for example. But then what you would have is the same verb inside the tasks in the classroom. So actually, verb of analyze would be inside the tasks that you use in the classroom. Not all the time, but they would be written into the overall planning. But essentially, the assessment task, if it is going to be fair, would reflect the same process. So inside your assessment task, there would be a question that would include that verb analyze. Now, of course, there are a whole range of these verbs, action verbs, they're described as, which you can identify, and you actually see the line going all the way through the three. So whether that's explain, investigate, synthesize, and so on, you could decide, but you can spot them in a very clear checklist to see how they run through all three elements.
That's a nice way to think about the intended learning outcomes, because again, with initial teachers or teachers with not as much experience, sometimes the learning outcomes are just repeated, or you get that same verb. So ideally, I suppose if you want to be developing a range of skills and then assessing a range of skills, you want to be having a selection of different verbs for those intended learning outcomes.
Definitely. And your intended learner outcomes, notice there are several of them, would be something that are both on a small scale, but actually something that's larger scale. So, and intended learning learner outcomes, importantly, are explicit to the student. So these are something often you could develop with your students, but they are known by the students. And there could be a whole range of them. And this could involve a lot of your sort of linguistic competencies, but a whole range of other things as well. But again, the important point being that you develop those and they should encompass the whole learning of the student in the course you're looking at, whether that's a class or a long-term course.
Let's talk a bit more about that overall planning and look at constructive alignment in lesson planning in general. So we've talked about it and with intended learning outcomes, but it does need to be considered in that longer lesson planning process, not just, it could be for one lesson, but it could be a series of lessons.
Yes, and here is really, again, if you arrest yourself at any moment when you're teaching, are teachers able to say what the intended learning outcome is? And often they may not. And similarly, the assessment process, we may take on an assessment task and not exactly know how that might relate to the intended learner outcome. What you're looking for with the constructive alignment is consistency. You're looking for the red thread. And this isn't just something that makes it neat and a pattern, it's actually to do with the cognitive processes and again strengthening and encouraging the candidate to be familiar with what the learning process is. So when that line is consistent, you have a cognitive consistency throughout, you're actually enhancing the student's ability to optimize their outcome. If you're chopping and changing and there's no logic, if you like, to those three elements, the student ends up at sea, a bit lost and unable to really see the process and get to grips with the process.
I mean, we could perhaps argue that this is one of the key things behind good teaching and helpful learning, that when you're planning a series of lessons, let's say you have a weekly scheme of work or timetable, that there is some kind of thread running through it perhaps.
Definitely, and there are a lot of other practices that are reflected in constructive alignment. One of them is good planning, but also actually is the fact, why do we have the assessment task? And we know that in fact the assessment task becomes a very critical part of the learning and it endorses so much of the other processing that goes on in the whole system. So it's about, yes, planning, it's about being aware of what your target is, but it's also looking at the whole timeline and the procedure from your planning, your exercising as a teacher, to the assessment task. And that could be an assessment task you develop yourself, something you draw from a course book, or it could be a high-stakes third-party exam. So there are a whole range of variables within the system and within that model.
The way you've described it, it sounds quite linear, so it's almost as if one is going from the intended learning outcomes to the planning to the assessment task, but it's not necessarily in that order, especially if you're working towards an external test, a high-stakes exam, like a national exam, for example.
Absolutely, and a teacher has to assess their teaching context and look at what you are working with, and it's very rare, as you and I know, that you'll have a circumstance or context where you would have complete freedom to decide what your ILOs are, your classroom activities and your assessment tasks. So often one or other of these are dictated to you. So you have to use this course book or that course book. You have to use the state curriculum to which you're teaching, or you have to use a certain high stakes test. That doesn't negate the whole model of constructive alignment, because let's say I'm using a test, I just have to turn this upside down and say, okay, well, I'm going to be working to that assessment, so I need to deconstruct the test a little bit, look at those action verbs that are inside that test, what's the test really asking the candidate to do, and then you build that backwards. So actually your intended learning outcome doesn't just say, my students are going to pass the test, because this is far more than just teaching to the test. What those intended learner outcomes will do is detail the learning processes, those cognitive verbs we've referred to, and it'll engender them, make sure they're in the whole process. So that's what constructive alignment would enable a teacher to do.
Right, that sounds like a very logical way of approaching it, and it's a lot of the things you've talked about, including the washback from tests and how teachers work to that, things that we're talking about in another couple of videos, so there was a nice link there. Finally, just I'd like to talk a little bit about how students can benefit from good constructive alignment. We've talked about how it can benefit the overall learning environment and provide a cohesive program of study for learners. But is there anything else you'd like to add on supporting students' needs?
If a student knows where they're going is one thing, they will be better able to get there. Or to put that in another way, if you don't know what you're aiming for, you're never going to hit it. So actually it's about transparency, and there's a lot in here about students knowing what the ILOs are or what the ATs are, whichever way you're going to approach the model. And the point is here, we know that this does in fact enhance the learning outcome if you can have that thread following through. But what we would look for is, if you're working with something like constructive alignment and you're looking at those action verbs, the cognitive verbs, these should really, in the ideal world, reflect the kind of processes that the student will be using in their real world contexts. So what are they doing outside of the learning environment? Obviously this depends, and you are constrained to a degree by the test or by the ILOs, but what the ideal model would see would be what we would call a high level of cognitive validity, meaning that the processes that we have written into the 3 stages are indicative and reflect the processes you'd use in the real world. Mm-hmm. So it's unlikely, for example, you're going to have a discrete item grammar narrative working through those. You could have grammar and accuracy, but far more likely you're going to have functional language, language functions, communicative functions and competencies, the kind of thing that will facilitate the student using language in the real world.
Okay, and if that's what's being assessed, that's what's being taught, that's what the objectives are, and really so that benefits the student going out with those real life skills.
And you used the word washback a few moments ago, and that is positive washback. So positive washback is usually something that we talk about from the perspective of a test, but if you combine notions of positive washback with something like constructive alignment, with other notions like cognitive validity, actually you can begin to put together a very strong learning system, and that's essentially what this is, a model to facilitate the learning.
Alex, thank you very much.
You're welcome, thank you very much.